welcome Christian to this aviation-based interview. We're going to be talking a little bit about your amazing thesis that you have recently completed on the area of sustainable aviation fuels and the profitability of airline. But first of all, do you just want to introduce yourself?
Okay, hello. So I'm Christian. I'm right now a student in aviation management in Germany, so at the University of Worms. I'm now in the final section of my studies. Right now, working at Fraport. So I'm in my last internship of my studies. A few months ago, I wrote this thesis on sustainable aviation fuels and some market-based measures to reduce the CO2 emissions in aviation, and also assess the costs that are associated with those options.
Yeah, fantastic. So if people aren't familiar with sustainable aviation fuels, it's probably a good place to start just describing what sustainable aviation fuels are and how widely used they currently are at the moment.
Okay, so the most important thing about sustainable aviation fuels is, from my point of view, the logic behind it and how CO2 emissions can actually be reduced with the sustainable aviation fuels. So we need to make one first point. I think they are not. There is no magic behind it. So if they are combusted in the combustion chamber of the engine, there are emissions. But the production of those sustainable aviation fuels is entirely different than the kind of production of normal fuel. So there is no digging of oil or something like that, but you produce the sustainable aviation fuels out of sustainable sources. And yeah, they can be very different. It can also be recycled sources, like used cooking oil or something like that. But the logic behind it is the so-called life cycle approach. And you make a life cycle, or you assess the life cycle emissions of a certain fuel. And the logic is that a plant usually absorbs in their lifetime some CO2 emissions, or some CO2 out of the air. And yeah, if you incorporate this in a kind of life cycle, you will see that those sustainable aviation fuels have a much better CO2 footprint than the conventional oil-based fuels that are digged. Yeah.
How long have sustainable aviation fuels been around for? Like, has there been much uptake?
Okay. So the idea of sustainable aviation fuels was quite actual since 2007, 2008, around 2010. So the idea was already there, and some laboratories were already there to discover the possibility of sustainable aviation fuels. We have kind of sustainable fuels in the automotive segment since years. There are sustainable gasoline for cars, but for aviation this was not boosted so fast. But the real boost for sustainable aviation fuels, I think, came some 4 years ago, around 2015, 16. And especially in the recent years, we have various pathways, so ways to produce sustainable aviation fuels approved. So those approvals raised in the last years dramatically. So the developments are now quite fast. So you have approvals for new fuels 2 times a year. So
right, okay. Do you think, like, what is driving that? Do you think it's some of the targets that have been set for the sector? Is it a way for airlines to meet these quite ambitious targets that have been laid down?
Now we're coming to the airline point of view. So I think all airlines want to reduce their emissions, but we have this huge cost pressure in the entire industry. We have low profit margins in the entire industry, and so we need to assess quite in detail how useful those sustainable aviation fuels are for the airlines with regards to their economic and ecologic targets. And this is quite interesting. So you see there are airlines that are right now incorporating the sustainable aviation fuels in their total fuel usage, let's say it. But this portion is very, very small. Was also one essential points made in my thesis, that an airline would have, even with the most, let's say, cheapest fuels, in a 50% blend with conventional fuels, 8 to 9% higher total operating costs, which would exceed the profits by far. So you need to start as an airline with lower blend ratios. So you simply take the sustainable aviation fuel and blend it with the conventional fuel, and then you have quite a good opportunity to adjust the costs. And we see also programs from various airlines that the passenger also can decide, okay, I want to compensate this, and I want to buy sustainable aviation fuel for my seat, let's say. So this is also an interesting approach for this.
Yeah, so it's like, I think I read in your thesis that the profitability of airlines is currently around 4 to 5% profit margin. So what you're saying is basically, if people were to use sustainable aviation fuels more widely, essentially it would just completely wipe out profits.
Yeah. So if we take the maximum blend ratios, so nearly all fuels have maximum blend ratios of 50% that are allowed at the moment. So you are not allowed to use more than 50% of sustainable aviation fuel. If you would go for this maximum blend ratio, no airline would be able to make profits. So this is at the moment not a useful case, not possible at the moment. But yeah, a few countries already introduced minimum blend ratios on the other side. So you have Norway, they introduced the minimum blend ratio, so every airline is using those sustainable aviation fuels in this minimum blend ratio, so it's mandatory. The effect of this on the operating costs is very, very small. So this blend ratio is about, I think, 1% or something like that. Okay. But yeah, this is also a possibility to go for some minimum blend ratios, but also keep the profit margins of airlines in mind. And
And of course, like, one thing that I was really interested in your thesis was talking about how, because of the various different targets that have been set on aviation, so linked to CORSIA with IATA and ICAO, that soon airlines are going to need to go down this route if there aren't imposed limits by their own countries anyway, because of course the credits that you were talking about in terms of the certificates, the carbon certificates, this is going to become a huge issue for airlines soon.
Yeah, so we basically have those two market-based measures that are focusing on offsetting emissions, so emissions that are already produced, let's say. The target is to invest the money gained from those measures to put it, or to invest it in CO2 reducing projects all over the world. And the airlines need to pay for those allowances to have those emissions. And there is on the one hand the EU ETS, and you already said CORSIA. EU ETS would cost the airlines much more than CORSIA, since there are two basic different approaches. So the EU ETS is kind of focusing on emissions that are for free. So every operator of an aircraft gets some emissions for free. but the majority needs to be paid. And this free emissions will be decreased in the next years in 2.2% per year. So a quite fast decrease, and the costs will rise for this EU ETS. CORSIA works a little bit different. CORSIA sets a baseline at the moment 2019 emissions of the industry or of the particular airline. And we all know that the emissions from 2019 are not reached last year and not reached yet, and will not be reached in maybe the next 1 to 2 years. And so the cost influence of CORSIA on the short term is not that dramatically, but if the allowances prices rise, it will be a dramatically increase. So, and the bridge to the sustainable aviation fuels in this regard is quite interesting. So in the EU ETS, you don't need to pay for allowances if you use sustainable aviation fuels on this particular flight.
Oh, right.
And that's increasing the attractivity of the sustainable aviation fuels even further. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you see that? Quite interestingly, there isn't any published prices in terms of sustainable aviation fuels, I see, at the moment. But do you expect that if airlines, the requirement goes up, obviously it's a bit of a volume game, do you see then the price decreasing and then it becoming a little bit more viable?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I definitely think that already in the next year, let's say 5 years, we will see a price decrease in those sustainable aviation fuels. Something that is heavily dependent on this are the feedstocks. So some feedstocks are quite regulated at the moment. So all feedstocks that are competing with food for humans or for animals are a little bit problematic at the moment. So the governments are forcing the industry a little bit to go to those feedstocks that are not competing with food for animals or something like that. Yeah. But we will see definitely a price decrease, maybe also for those sustainable aviation fuels, or especially for those sustainable aviation fuels that are quite expensive in the moment. So this is, for example, power to liquid, where you basically extract the CO2 out of the air and produce sustainable aviation fuel with this. So very easily said, but that's the logic behind it. In the moment, there are quite high costs due to the technology behind it, but we all know that if we have gains in technology, the prices decrease quite fast.
Okay, interesting. So do you think that there's a lot of things that the industry is doing at the moment to try and reduce their emissions, but a lot of them potentially are still somewhere in the distance. Do you think that sustainable aviation fuels will still have a place in the market once those technologies have been implemented and rolled out? I'm thinking the likes of, the new hydrogen technology that's going on, the electric out. Do you think that potentially sustainable aviation fuels will still be relevant once that technology has been brought in? To some extent, yes. If we take a look at on the normal operating lifetime of an aircraft, which is 20 to 30 years, this will be relevant, as those aircraft are just produced with a conventional combustion chamber and using conventional fuel or sustainable aviation fuel. So we will definitely make use of this longer than the introduction of those hydrogen aircraft. But if we take a look on the timeline, so I think we won't see any bigger commercial hydrogen aircraft before 2040, 2045, or even 2050. So sustainable aviation fuels can be used as a kind of bridge technology to come to those
it's so relevant that we need it for minimum 30 years. Even on a long scale time frame, we need those sustainable aviation fuels.
Fantastic. So within your research, you looked at sort of the two traditional business models within the airlines. One being the low cost carrier, and then the other one being the full service network carrier. Do you want to talk a little bit about how sustainable aviation fuels affects the two models differently?
There's quite in the nature of the operating costs of both business models a little different. So on the one hand, we have this full service network carrier, which has all in all higher costs than the low cost carrier, and has quite higher costs, especially in terms of service or even maintenance or ticket sales or something like that. So the network carriers are engaging in different sales channels and so on. So they have naturally also higher costs, also higher staff costs. And the low-cost carrier is quite focusing on this core product, so the flight, low costs for staff, naturally low cost for fuel, which is also true for the network carrier. Both are focusing on that, but they are more concentrating on the core product, and so the portion of the costs of fuel is naturally higher at the low-cost carrier than at the full-service network carrier, due to this concentration on the core product. And if those fuel costs are rising due to the application of sustainable aviation fuels, the low-cost carriers are likely to have a little bit higher cost impact than the full-service network carriers.
So, what do you think it sounds like, we have, because of the targets that are going to come in, there's going to be increasing pressure on the airlines. They're going to have to do something to reduce their emissions. Otherwise, they'll pay in other ways, whether it's using sustainable aviation fuels, which are more expensive, or whether it's, the carbon certificates and having to pay for those. So what do you think the airlines are going to do in response to this in order to be able to cope?
I think one thing I already mentioned is quite heavy, but it needs to be done. So you need to pass a portion of those costs to the customer. So you won't be able to cover all those extra costs for offsetting or for sustainable aviation fuels without passing them on to the customer. But I think it's also a little rethinking in the customer's mind needed. So the flight price overall will change a little bit, will go a little bit higher. But this topic I already mentioned before, that the customer is paying for his seat for the use of sustainable aviation fuels or something like that. So I hope there is also a little rethinking in the customer's mind, and without this, it's probably not possible. And we have such low profit margins that an airline is not able to cope these costs without handing them over to the customers.
Yeah. So do you think then? Do you have any idea in terms of increase? Would you be able to guess at a kind of percentage increase that would be needed?
If we simply take those sustainable aviation fuels, where we would have in the maximum blend ratio, for example, 8 to 9% higher operating costs, as I reported in my thesis, plus the costs for the offsetting, this is heavily dependent on the certificate price for those offsets. We can easily say that it will be in the year 2030, so let's say 9 to 10 years ahead, a plus of 10% higher costs.
Okay, so I think, potentially for some people, they might be put off. But when you said about like an education piece for customers, do you think that the market will bear that sort of price increase? Do you think that it's something that customers will also be willing to pay, or do you think it might result in lower lower passenger numbers?
I think it's quite the combination of post-COVID and the thesis is quite interesting. So I don't know how the prices will develop even after COVID. But yes, I maybe think that the demand is very, very slightly then a little bit influenced by the higher prices. But overall, I think we will have this constant growth of the industry. And in the end, a globalized world is heavily dependent on aviation. So yeah, there might be a quite small influence, so that some customer groups are thinking twice of flying in their vacations or something like that. But the overall influence, I think, is very limited.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. In your thesis, you spoke about the EU blending mandate that's going to be discussed this year. Do you think the likelihood is that other people are going to follow suit and mandate that traditional fuels are blended with sustainable aviation fuels?
Yeah, we have, especially in the EU, we have the majority of countries which is caring very much about this entire CO2 issue. Also, some other countries around the world are caring about this. But if we take a look on other aviation markets in the US or even in China, which is a market with rapid growth, even now they have quite a post-COVID time, so the demand is already, I think, recovered on some routes. I think in those aviation markets, it's quite no issue for the next years to introduce such blending ratios, since they are increasing or experiencing quite significant growth. Also, Africa might be a growing market in the next years, and especially in those markets, I think that those blend ratios now are unfortunately no topic in the next years.
Okay. So do you think that might potentially create a bit of an unfair unfair competition in the market if you have some people that are mandated that they need to increase their costs using sustainable aviation fuels, and then you've got other people where they can just go along with the traditional cheaper fuels? That's potentially going to create an unfair advantage for certain airlines.
Also, this is also a point where I would this can be applied on the customer. So if this whole CO2 issue is also in the customer's mind, which I think becomes even more relevant in the next years, but is also extremely relevant, a customer might decide to fly with an airline that is caring about this issue, that is maybe using sustainable aviation fuels or compensating the CO2 emissions. And I think the customer is capable or will be ready to pay a little bit more for the ticket if those things are a topic at the airline, and if the airline cares about such things. We have quite interesting in Germany an airline. What's the name? I think Green Airlines or something like that. They are flying, I think, one route from Mannheim to or from Karlsruhe to Munich, something like that. But they focus on this approach, and yeah, it's working. So the customer is ready to pay a little bit more for the ticket if the CO2 footprint of the airline is better than at another airline.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, I think you're right. I think this is becoming a very prominent topic for people. And yeah, I do agree that certain passengers are going to be more attracted to airlines that are seen to be doing something about their emissions. So that's fantastic. So if people wanted to learn a little bit more about this topic, are there any resources that you would recommend for people?
Basically the best sources for this to get a short overview or a comprehensive overview is the Sustainable Aviation Fuels guide from ICAO. So they are covering every topic of the Sustainable Aviation Fuels, but in quite small chapters. So I would definitely recommend this to read through. With the market-based measures, we have also IATA, which is caring about this very much. So the cost influence is there, and if this is there, IATA plays a certain role in this whole construct. And for this, I would recommend some IATA sources. But for the Sustainable Aviation Fuels, I definitely recommend the ICAO Sustainable Aviation Fuels Guide, since ICAO is also involved in the certification of those fuels. So this is also a nice source for that.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Any final last thoughts for people? If you want people to take certain things away from this chat, what would you say?
I would definitely say that people should go more in their mind when they book a ticket, and maybe research if the airline is more CO2 efficient than the other airline, or is caring more about the CO2 emissions than the other airline, or maybe you try to use those sustainable aviation fuels, for example, with those with those programs where you pay for your seats a little bit more and compensate your flight. Nearly every airline offers this option, and simply caring about CO2 emissions a bit more, and simply thinking if you want to fly, that you compensate it a little bit with your prices.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Christian. It's been so good to talk to you about this topic. It's something I find incredibly interesting, and we'll keep sort of monitoring the airlines and the progress that our industry makes towards sustainable aviation fuels and the investment for the future. And thank you very much for educating us a little bit more on this topic.
Thank you too. Thank you for the possibility to present my results.
No problem at all. Thank you very much, Christian.